Prologue. They started as co-workers, but ended up as bitter enemies. A man and a woman stood by the large window, admiring the scenery outside. Luke heard a noise and turned to glare at the former members of the squad lounging on the sofa. They had all been transplanted into the modern world, away from the battles they were once so accustomed to. The man, named Han Yuson and nicknamed Luke, held a cup of coffee which emitted steam. He used to fight alongside the warrior squad, but now he had parted ways with them. Luke heard a noise and turned to glare at the former members of the squad lounging on the sofa. And if you put them all in order, Luke called out from the bathroom. Leonard von Greenheim, leader of the warrior squad and the youngest, most skilled warrior, lifted the toilet seat and asked if he could drink water from the bowl. Valian Rex, the powerful warrior and mercenary, sat in front of the TV watching an ad for underwear. He commented that there were many beautiful women in the ad. Sylvia, a devout clergywoman and advocate for purity, sat next to him feeling embarrassed and indignant. She said that the ad was shameless and indecent. Mirni, the Catwoman, a skilled thief and gambling addict, sat on the opposite end of the sofa and admired the magazines without paying attention to the TV. Alicia Moonlight was present. The ghostly elf, an archer with racist tendencies, stood by the window and was angered by the onlookers who stared at her. She demanded that Luke open the window. Luxie was the kingdom's top magician, known to be highly dangerous. She examined the wall mechanism and requested permission from Luke to disassemble it. Aram, alarmed by this suggestion, questioned if Yuson truly intended to proceed. Although the war had ceased, their ability to cope with society remained uncertain. Luke's frustration caused him to fracture the mug he was holding. Whether they could regain Luke's favor remained uncertain. Enraged, he demanded that they vacate his apartment. One chapter. The dark night covered the mountains and forests. A man with a scar on his face yelled at the search group with dogs to catch the fugitives. They must try their best because the fugitives couldn't go far, and many are still at large. The warriors who defeated the devil kept running through the dense growth, hiding from the searching soldiers. Mirni swore and angrily asked why this had happened and what they did wrong. Alicia, running beside her, calmly said they made a mistake. She thought it was the fault of the person who mocked their intelligence and physical ability. Valian turned to her, offended by the accusation, and asked what kind of attack this was, since he said nothing. Alicia replied by asking if he was offended by what she said. Mirni ignored their argument and asked about the attacks. Valian responded irritably, saying that Luke had already told him and that there was no need for accusations. After a brief argument, they grew quiet and continued to jog silently. All of a sudden, Leonard pondered what could have changed if Luke had been present. Sylvia, placing her hand on her head, quietly murmured that he always stopped them from making silly choices, and maybe, if he had been around, everything would have turned out better. Mirni didn't like the conversation, so she asked Sylvia to stop talking about absent people. She was tired of Sylvia's rambling and didn't want to hear more. When Sylvia asked why, Mirni explained that she didn't think Luke would be helpful if he were there. On the contrary, she believed he would harm them instead of helping. She looked at Alicia with an evil grin and called her a dumb girl, asking if it was true. Alicia reacted by telling her not to call her that, or she would kill her. Sylvia interrupted, telling everyone to stop arguing. But then she fell silent when she saw a white light shining over her head. Everyone crowded around her, excitedly exclaiming that it was a sign from God and that they were not forsaken. Sylvia's eyes filled with a bright light from above. She put her hand on her chest and spoke in a different voice to convince her children. The warriors admired her. Sylvia pointed to the edge of the cliff, instructing them to jump. The light above her head vanished. The fighters didn't understand. They talked about what it meant. When he said rock, he meant for them to leap from Carb's rock. Valian asked Sylvia if the goddess said anything else, but she closed her eyes sadly and replied, "No more revelations." Mirni angrily kicked the ground, shouting that this meant certain death. The others remained silent, thinking about the goddess's words. Leonard grabbed their attention by telling them firmly to go. Hearing him, they approached, asking indignantly what he meant, and if he was crazy. He said he wasn't crazy. That's why he offered it. He invited them to consider the other perspective and choose. Would it be better to die now following the goddess? Luxie asked, as she turned towards the grove where torches could be seen and sounds could be heard. Or should they be caught and suffer death by torture? He said that dying quickly, there was better than being caught and dying painfully. He didn't want to just die if they were caught. Leonard faced the cliff and spoke. After he finished speaking, he walked towards the cliff. The others looked surprised. Mirni said she would go with him because what else could they do? But die? Alicia called them crazy, but still went with them to the cliff. Sylvia stayed quiet, gazing quietly at her friends. She couldn't believe it had already been 3 years since their team reunited. As they neared the cliff's edge, fear overtook them. They had no idea what lay ahead. Discussing the possibility of dying, Mirni proposed they vow not to reunite in the next life. The group nodded in agreement and remained fixed on the ground below. Leonard firmly declared his plan and took the lead, jumping first. The others quickly followed. A group of soldiers who rescued the world fell into a never-ending abyss. In the morning, the commander of the pursuing soldiers arrived at the cliff where they leaped into and questioned why they perished in vain. He pondered to himself and answered that it was likely their best option because they didn't have anywhere else to turn to. He turned to the soldiers and loudly ordered them to send a group to investigate because they needed to at least find the bodies. The soldiers quickly followed the order. The fighters regained consciousness and found themselves in an unfamiliar location in a clearing. Mirni was surprised and asked if they had died and where they were. Alicia rubbed her eyes and asked what happened. She then felt embarrassed upon realizing that she was sitting on Valiant's face, who was just coming to. She asked if they were in Valhalla and what it smelled like. Leonard, surprised, asked what had happened and didn't notice Alicia jump up and kick Valiant. Upon hearing rustling in the bushes, he turned to see what it was and loudly asked who was there, catching everyone's attention. As Luke stepped out into the clearing, he grumpily questioned the identity of the person there. However, upon seeing the group of people, his expression swiftly shifted from vexed to disdainful, muttering about the situation being messed up. Leonard recognized him and came over joyfully, thanking the goddess for the aid sent their way. He was about to mention how long it had been, but Luke rudely interrupted with a harsh kick to the face. He was knocked down by the powerful hit and lost consciousness. The others stared at him in terror as Valiant called out his name uncertainly. Ignoring them, Luke asked the fallen Leonard if he thought it was amusing. He then laughed menacingly, glancing at the scared group and the unconscious Leonard. Someone inquired what was wrong. He stopped laughing and stared at them with anger. He spoke in a scary tone and said he wanted to dismember them because they were awful people. After a heartwarming reunion, Luke, Yuson desperately craved a cigarette. Chapter 2. The man drove through the city at night and spoke with his mom on the phone. She asked if he ate, and he said yes, telling her to take care of herself and eat more. She said he knew everything and asked him to come home for New Year's. He smiled and joked that someone might think he never goes home. He still comes home every month. He turned the steering wheel and pulled into the parking lot. After parking, he said goodbye and disconnected before getting out of the car. Yuson walked towards the exit of the parking lot and used his fingerprint to open the door. The mechanism on the wall immediately confirmed his arrival. Yuson confirmed this as he took off his shoes. The machine asked if he wanted to hear about foreign stock news or home stock prices today. He walked by without replying. The machine's name was Aram, an artificial intelligence program obtained from an acquaintance years ago during a distribution. Originally, it was designed to safeguard government employees, but a significant flaw was found, and an acquaintance took it in secret. Now it's Yusung's AI assistant. so he allowed it to make its own decisions. As Aram entered, he happily called Yuson to tell him he planted a voice phishing virus today and asked for praise. He instructed him to stick to smaller scams. When Yuson heard this, he realized Aram wasn't a top-notch professional, but a scammer. Aram readily agreed. Yuson turned to admire the sunset visible through the window and pondered. 10 years have gone by since he came back from Midgard. A decade ago, when he was only 17, he suddenly found himself in a foreign world Midgard. When his eyes opened, he realized he had been shackled in a slave bazaar in the middle of a desert. Despite the screaming, he got marked on his skin. He was young and had all his limbs, so they sold him as a gladiator. Contrary to what was expected, when he traveled to another world, he lacked any skills or connections. He was forced to live in a cage, treated worse than a pet, and given low-quality food, unfit for even a stray dog. He had to consume it, as during the day, he fought gladiatorial battles for his life, and at night, he was in danger of sexual assault. In the end, he risked his life for survival by staging a rebellion similar to those in the movies. He informed everyone that they would no longer be slaves if they followed him, and they successfully fled the riot. He spent 2 years as a fugitive in the desert and 3 years working as a mercenary in the city. He saved some money and eventually discovered an advertisement on a notice board seeking warriors to defeat a demon. Those who succeeded would be granted any wish by the goddess. This was exactly what he had been searching for, and he was thrilled. Applying to join the army, he passed a very difficult test. It was a bit like applying for a job at a big company. Eventually, he became part of a group of soldiers and started traveling with them as a supporter. He wasn't sure if his reading, writing, and accounting skills would come in handy because most people in this world can't read or write. He checked the map once more. Anyway, he became a porter for the warrior group for another 5 years. They eventually succeeded in defeating the devil. In order to return home, he fought relentlessly and strived to accumulate as much merit as possible. As he clenched the cigarette between his teeth, he couldn't help but curse these so-called warriors. He was only 27 years old when they captured the demon. After smoking one cigarette, he tossed the butt on the ground and lit another. He sighed with relief, happy to have finished. He only had left hair, wrinkles, and problems now. He made a wish to the goddess, and she understood he was not from this world. She promised to grant his wish and hoped he would appreciate the reward for his dedication. He tearfully gazed at the statue, overwhelmed with joy, and then he came back to the real world at 17, before going to another world. He knew that money and power equal justice in this tough world. So, after high school, he passed the exam to become a collector. After that, he grew richer through investments in cryptocurrency. Later, he became the head of a bankrupt gaming company and created a game that resembled the world of Midgard. Sitting at his computer with a game running, he spoke ironically about someone who wants to forget and does something similar. But he couldn't finish because an AI interrupted, asking if he talked about a lucid dream experience. Yuson loudly denied that it was a lucid dream, affirming it was reality. I confessed his real worry about his mental health. He calmly stated that it became this way because of the frustrating warriors. And don't talk about it anymore. He's got a daily mission to finish. After a while, a message appeared on the screen indicating that he had died. His teammates in the chat laughed and replied to his question about what they were doing by saying he couldn't do anything and was just harassing them. Yuson was frustrated and held his head after playing for 3 hours. I called out to him, asking if he wanted to stop, as he could hear his heart beating faster. He took the drink and said, "You need to calm down. The most important thing is to have a strong character." He explained that feeling this way is normal and began searching for the group again, warning to avoid trolls. When he saw that the detachment search had ended, he assumed they had been found. Instead of seeing the party, Yuson heard the statue speak like a child and stared at the screen, surprised that it had a voice function. The voice repeated the question if Yuson remembered him. Yuson put his drink on the table and admired the statue, noticing the other director had done a good job, but he didn't know when the updates were made. The statue complained about how annoying it was that Yuson had forgotten about him, even though much time had passed. He seemed to grasp something and calmly inquired if she was the source of all the conflict. She acknowledged that he had not forgotten about her, but before she could finish, Yuson forcefully punched the monitor upon receiving confirmation of his words. After witnessing this, he asked in disbelief if everything was actually real. Chapter 3. The statue repeated "child" and asked about the sound. Yuson realized it wasn't the computer and calmed down. He touched his head and said they hadn't seen each other in a long time. He called her the Mother of War. The statue said that was her middle name and suggested he call her Io. He asked if they already had a relationship, and the statue confirmed it was true. Her presence didn't seem very welcome. Smoke continued to come from a hole in the computer monitor where the sound had originated. Yuson admitted that her voice reminded him of the difficult days when he tried to leave that place. The statue took responsibility, acknowledging that it was her fault for not properly caring for her children, resulting in the problem. She hopes he won't hate Midgard so much and would rather hate her. He asked what happens ultimately in that world. Io, not expecting him to agree, stuttered and asked if he would listen to her. He calmly said they would talk. Before delving into the story, she said they needed to get to the main point and asked for his help. He asked what he could assist her with, surprised. She inquired if he could go to the nearest mountain. Upon hearing his question about grief, she clarified that she wasn't asking for assistance free of charge. He will give him the elixir and sap of the world tree. He was shocked, staring at the screen as the statue ordered him to go to the mountain initially. Despite the presence of warriors, he laughed and suddenly realized what he needed to do. The elixir is a powerful medicine that not only heals the soul, but also extends life. The sap from the world tree is a potent elixir that can cure any ailment, including disabilities. The reason for offering such a valuable resource is to help those in need. Gazing upon the group of people in the area, the speaker expressed an intense desire to destroy them all. Mirni was asked loudly what Velian was doing. Velian attacked the guy with anger, swinging and forcefully hitting him in his stomach. Yuson blocked the blow easily with his hand. He then grabbed Velian's hand and threw him over himself, making him fall to the ground. Yuson declared that even without magical powers, he would still beat a person like him. Velian attempted to respond, but remained quiet after being hit by Yuson. Leonard regained consciousness and attempted to launch a surprise attack on his opponent with a sword from behind. The opponent stood up quickly, turned around, and moved closer to Leonard, forming a stance with one fist folded and one outstretched, then asked if he knew about the 1-inch blow. Leonard was shocked as he witnessed the fist in the stomach, and within seconds, he was thrown away by the unexpected and mighty blow. The remaining girls in the open space were terrified as he approached them. Sylvia raised her hand in self-defense. He quickly approached and grabbed the wand from her hand, breaking it in the process. He thanked her for it, explaining that he needed a baton instead. In order to keep him at a distance, she pulled out a magic wand. Sylvia looked at her broken wand in confusion at first, then realized what had happened and screamed in horror. He turned to her and said she had enough, then went to Alicia, who was trying to summon a spirit. Alicia was still questioning why the spirit didn't materialize. Raising her head, she saw a baton swinging toward her and was hit on the head with it while Mirni watched. He turned to her and said she had enough, then went to Alicia, who was trying to summon a spirit. She attempted a quick and unnoticed escape. Yuson noticed something, and without paying attention to the club he was holding, he picked up a stone from the ground and threw it at her. The stone hit her leg, causing it to break, and she fell down, crying out in pain. Yuson then turned to Luxie and asked if she planned to resist, to which Luxie calmly raised her hands and replied that she had no magical powers and could not defeat him, so she should surrender. He tapped her hand with a baton, smiling as he stated that he knew she was a sorceress and how great it was to be smart. Then he struck her on the head. He stood alone in the clearing as the defeated warriors continued to scream in pain. Yuson picked up the phone and asked the statue if it would reprimand him. She asked if she had the authority to do so. Despite this, she requested that he be a little kinder and exhibit kindness at least once. He became furious and asked if he was being kind by not killing them. The statue requested to be heard out and explained that she had previously sent him back to his world and restored all the time he lost. Remembering this, he should be more benevolent. If she had mentioned this earlier, he might not have reacted that way, but she only brought it up afterward. In any case, he should be more clever. No, smarter. He scratched his head and let out a deep breath. "I'll need a potion first," he said. The statue replied, "I have no doubt you're a good kid." He felt relieved that he hadn't done anything wrong. Chapter 4. After receiving the backpack, he looked at its contents and gave it to Luxie, saying that this should be enough, and ordered 2 of them to drink the potion and the girl with the broken arm and leg to put some on the wound. When she asked why her, he replied that he had hit her the least, and if she was okay, he would let her start. Luxie pointed to her head and said she was in pain too. Yuson irritably asked if he should hurt her more. Luxie anxiously took the backpack and said that she understood and went to the other warriors. After a while, they all came to their senses and looked at Yuson with fear and hatred. He told them to look him in the eye and said that if they wanted a second round, he didn't care. Sylvia took it upon herself to ask if he was going to kill her. He laughed and replied that despite the fact that 10 years had passed, she was just as slow-witted, and if he really wanted to kill her, he would have done it right away. Surprised, she said that it had not been 10 years, but only 3, and asked what he was going to do if he did not kill her. He replied that he had recently received a request, and not even a request, but an order from Io. They rejoiced when they heard the order from whom. Yuson explained nothing further and turned and walked away, telling them to follow him if they'd come to their senses. Alicia angrily said that if she had magic powers, she could fight back. Valian replied that she wouldn't even be able to deal with him because he was on a different level, not like hers, not even comparable to what it was 3 years ago. When she asked him what he meant, he replied that it was Yuson who single-handedly won the battle against the general of the Devil's Army 3 years ago. And having become even stronger, he now defeated him and Leon in one fell swoop without magic. Alicia looked at Leon in shock, who said with an apologetic smile, not paying attention to Luke walking in front of him, that he was very strong. And this was nothing compared to 3 years ago. The car drove quickly through the night streets, Mirni leaning against the window and admiring the night sky and the buildings flying by. Luxie, also looking out the window, asked Luke if she could ask him a question, which he allowed with some hesitation. She asked if this carriage moved with the help of magic. Luke replied that it moved with the help of technology. Luxie suggested that, in this case, it was some kind of special city that had such carriages. Luke, who was driving, again denied her words and said that there were such cars in every family. Take Midgard, for example. Every villager has one. She approached and asked if they were now in the capital of this world. Luke again answered in the negative, explaining that this was only one of the cities. And by the way, there's no such thing as the capital of the world. But there are a lot of countries, and the most powerful country among them can be called the center of the world. Luxie asked what the situation was like in the country they were in. He replied that he didn't know about the military strength, but the economy seemed to be in the place. And when he turned his head in her direction, he noticed that her face still looked confused. She muttered thoughtfully that this was surprising and fell silent. They wondered what the hell it meant that everyone had such a car. The country was Tinthian economy, and this place was one of many cities. They quickly arrived at his house, when he went in and then Leon entered. I greeted him again, and asked who these people were that he brought with him, if they were his guests. He exhaled irritably and said that, first of all, they were unwanted guests. I said that in that case, he would set the protection to level 3 and change the video surveillance in the room to 24 hours. Luke agreed under the gaze of all the warriors who entered. Lixie looked at him and asked Luke in surprise where he got the ego weapon if he said there was no magic in this world. He replied that this was not an ego weapon, but an artificial intelligence. Consider it the same as an imaginary person. Turning to them and seeing that they still didn't understand anything, he told them to just consider that this whole building is a weapon of the ego, because that would be easier for them to understand. And staring at them menacingly, he pointed his finger in their direction and warned that if even one thing in the house was missing or broken, they could consider themselves all corpses. Having listened in horror to his words, that they could consider themselves corpses if anything were to disappear, they all stared at Mirni, who said in horror that she hadn't even done anything yet. As they all went into the living room and sat down on the couches, Luke opened a bottle of soda and asked if Io wanted him to guarantee their existence. The statue asked what he thought, to which he replied that there was no need to be cunning since he had already brought her to him. And he took a sip from the glass. Sylvia and Alicia, who suffered from mysophobia, perhaps understood him. He had to be patient, but he still didn't understand what he was getting into. Putting the jar on the table, he got their attention and said that the goddess wanted him to help them survive, or rather, to help them adapt and adjust to this world. The warriors looked at him in surprise. He went on to say that he did not know what they were doing in Midgard, but in any case, they were getting into trouble again because it was in their spirit. Hearing his words, Alicia jumped up angrily from her seat and pointed her finger in his direction, telling him to watch his words and not to treat her like a criminal and a sinner because she had not sinned. He walked over to her and mockingly asked her how she could have become a refugee in such a case, ignoring her attempts to justify herself and saying that he was still not interested in her unjust circumstances. Anyway, there was only one thing he had to do. For at least 1 year, he will help them adapt to this world. That means he will teach them the structure of the world, the knowledge of this world, and the ability to survive. Alicia asked in surprise why he was putting so much effort into teaching them. He asked why. She asked why, leaning down to her face and looking into her eyes. He said that the thought of having to see their stupid faces every day made him feel very sick, and he told her not to say that she had forgotten that he and she had not been colleagues from the beginning, but that they were worse than strangers to each other and had rather hostile relations. Hearing these words, everyone silently closed their eyes and agreed with his words. If learning from someone like him hurts their ego, then they have to accept it. From the moment they entered there, they were just a request from the goddess and nothing more, so let them do their best to learn how to survive and get out of there. Luke turned and left, saying he would give them a day to think about it, and Aram would teach them how to use the equipment. They watched silently as the door closed. After Luke left, there was a deathly silence in the hall that was broken by Aram asking if anyone was hungry. Valian raised his hand and asked, first of all, if they didn't need to eat to survive. He was a shameless barbarian. Chapter 5. When the table was filled with various foods, they sat down and began to try them. Mirni took the pizza, and after tasting it, she was thrilled. Valian said that that bastard Luke had the best cook in the world. Mirni approached Alicia and asked if elves could eat meat, to which she simply told her to shut up. Leonard sadly remarked that Luke still doesn't like them, to which Mirni quickly replied that he probably hates them more than demons. As he said, their relationship was worse than that of enemies, and so it was, because starting in the village of Phildea, they had already... She did not finish, interrupted by Sylvia, who told her to stop. After apologizing, they continued to eat in silent tension. Meanwhile, Luke, in his office, called an acquaintance and asked him to help him find a way to legally make 6 identity cards, saying that they were some kind of refugees who had entered the country illegally, asked not to ask anything else because he would throw off photo and do your best." After the call ended, he exhaled in relief and rubbed his shoulder. The statue spoke again, saying that she was very sorry and that she did not know that in this world so many difficult conditions must be met in order to exist. He leaned back in his chair, frowning and sighing again as he told her to forget it, that he was only doing this because there was a price to pay. She said she remembered, and she swore on her name to keep her promise if he kept his grudge and promised to help the children. Luke thought they were the most problematic people he had ever met. The clock read 12:00, but none of the warriors had woken up yet. Luke irritably asked what they were doing in the middle of the day. The statue begged him to understand, for they had not been able to rest in peace for the past 3 months, and their fatigue was showing. He asked what was so great about these bastards that she would always take their side. The statue replied that she was just trying to make him feel more welcome. He replied that this was an unacceptable request, not immediately noticing the door open and Sylvia enter, only turning to face her when she called out to him. He said sarcastically that he was very surprised that Sylvia, who had previously tormented him by forcing him to pray every day at dawn, had finally woken up. Sylvia justified herself by saying that it was because she was very tired in the fall. But at that moment, to his surprise, she corrected herself and said that he was right and that she really had become lazy and badly behaved because she was an apostle of the goddess. Bowing her head, she thanked him for his reproach. With a still irritated expression on his face, he closed his eyes and told her to wash up and wake up the others for dinner. Otherwise, they might think she had put on her makeup with drool. Sylvia said nothing, just rubbed her face in embarrassment. After some time, the three of them, Sylvia and the other girls, stood in the bathroom and took showers, periodically looking up at the shower itself and marveling at how the water could flow on its own, without magic. Mirni was about to drink water from the toilet when Arnie loudly announced that it was forbidden to drink from there. She asked in surprise if that meant the toilet was not a well. Leonard looked at the brush in surprise and thought how developed this world is, that everything in it is incredible. The soap and shampoo are so fragrant, the toothbrush and paste, and even the towel and pajamas are soft, as if made of sheepskin. When they finished the morning procedures, Luke came out to them already gathered in the living room, wiped his hand with a towel, and said that their clothes would be delivered today during the day. Sylvia said that they already had clothes, to which Luke replied that if they went out in them, they would look more like circus monkeys, and asked if that suited them. She asked if the style of clothing in this world was different from what they were used to. Luke didn't answer, but turned around and told Aram to turn on the TV. He opened an ad for underwear, and Luke said that these were ordinary clothes in this world. But the soldiers did not listen to him and stared at the underwear in righteous anger, saying it was obscene. Luke angrily asked them why they thought the clothes of their world were not obscene, even though they dressed much more openly there. And this is just one example of underwear. They breathed a sigh of relief, and Sylvia apologized for her words. He didn't listen and said that anyway, Aram had measured their sizes yesterday and ordered suitable clothes and underwear for them to get ready. Alicia called him out indignantly, asking what this meant. Covering her breasts with her hands, she asked if he had really examined and touched their bodies. Luke, who had already calmed down, became angry again, shouting that he was not crazy to look at her and that he would rather look at the naked body of the goblin. He told Aram to do so only because they had been asleep for a long time. In a calmer tone, he went on to repeat to them that as soon as their clothes arrived, they needed to get ready to leave. They needed to go to a lawyer's office to get their IDs done. Leonard asked in surprise what kind of IDs that was, and couldn't he just go to the guild and get them? Luke replied that things were not that simple and scratched his head, wondering if kindergarten teachers suffered the same way. A little later, they finally arrived at the office, and Yuson, leaving the soldiers waiting for him in the corridor, went into the office. Mirni touched her sweater in the chest area, thinking it was comfortable. Sylvia besieged her, saying it was indecent, and Io covered the ears of Mirni and Alicia. The lawyer said that first of all, If they were caught as illegal immigrants, there would be big problems. So it was better to apply for refugee status. And he had a friend there. Maybe they would be approved. Yuson breathed a sigh of relief and thanked him. He then asked if he knew it was not free. He promised to transfer the payment to his virtual account and left the office to the soldiers waiting for him in the hallway. When he came out, he leaned his back against the wall and sighed heavily. Sylvia got up from her seat and approached him, asking if everything was all right. He replied by asking what she thought he looked like. She bowed her head and apologized for making him spend a lot of money. Yuson, he said he didn't care because he would still take payment from Io. Sylvia tried to object, but Io beat her to it, saying that she did not have the currency of this world. He asked if they were serious now and didn't understand jokes. And he said that if everything goes according to plan, their IDs will be ready in 2 months. And now they went to the mall. Mirni asked in surprise what kind of mall it was. Yuson explained that it is a place where everything is sold, from food to clothes and various tools. It is where they will buy the things they need, so if they need anything, they should say so. Mirni, not paying attention to Sylvia, who asked if what they had already received was not enough for them, happily asked to buy her jewelry and clothes. The other warriors, looking at her, thought that life was teaching her nothing. Chapter 6. Luke, asleep in the hotel, was awakened by loud knocking at the door and persistent voices calling out to him, asking if he was there. He opened the door, yawned, and asked what was going on, to which the knight in front of him replied that one of his warriors had stolen the Margrave safe and that he should follow them. And without ceremony he grabbed him by his clothes and dragged him along, ignoring his attempts to explain himself. He realized it was the crazy bitch Mirni. Yuson asked what he was going to buy her. She again replied that she wanted clothes and jewelry. He said the clothes were fine, but asked why she needed jewelry. She happily replied that she wanted to see how beautiful the jewelry was in this world. If this world is so advanced, then the jewelry craftsmanship must be amazing. After saying that, she looked at him with pitiful eyes and begged him to buy the jewelry anyway. Yuson thought that this snake was good at seduction, and with such a temperament, one might think that she was from the Meow clan. He shouted her name and put his hand in front of her face. And he said that he immediately warned her that in this world, the protection of public order is at a completely different level in Midgard. And even if the Lord of Robbers comes there, all of them in this world will be caught with a probability of 98%. He approached her and said, especially if she does not use her magic there and does not watch her hands, she will be caught right away. And the moment she is caught, all ties between him and her will disappear. And to tell the truth, if it were his personal wish, it would be better if she forgot his words and stole everything. Mirni's face darkened as she looked into Yosung's stern eyes, and then she lowered her head and said that she was just sincerely looking forward to seeing how the crafting had developed, and he didn't need to worry about it so much. However, she would remember his advice. He said goodbye with a smile and turned his back on the gloomy girl, pleased with himself, and thinking that this bad habit would not go anywhere. He said goodbye, and now there will be one less parasite. As she left the store, Mirni smiled happily and thanked Yuson, who was standing by the car, for the clothes. Noticing that he said nothing, she asked him what was wrong. Scratching his cheek, he thoughtfully said nothing. Yuson couldn't believe it. He continued to look at Mirni and demanded that those in the car move to get inside. This girl, obsessed with stealing, hadn't taken anything. It couldn't be that she'd gotten smart. If it weren't for her almighty dexterity and fighting skills, she would have been kicked out of the warrior troop long ago. Now, even if she saw some tasty prey in the shop, she would just walk past it. He got behind the wheel and looked gloomily at Mirni, who was sitting in the back seat, unable to understand what kind of tricks she was performing. When Yuson, I greeted him again, Mirni rushed past him in a hurry to try on new things. Yuson, who came after her, ordered Aram to scan her body and check for the presence of precious metals. Aram announced that he had finished the examination and that nothing had been found. He asked if really nothing was found. Aram replied that 100 had been scanned and they were all clean. Hearing this, Yuson thought for a moment, then smiled happily and said he understood that she had a head injury. Mirni ignored him and happily tried on new clothes in front of the mirror, saying that they were very nice and that they were much more refined than in Midgard, and even the decoration was elegant. And the price is 1/1,000 of the price of a suit worn by aristocrats. Looking admiringly in the mirror, she asked if he could buy her more clothes like that. When she heard no answer, she looked sadly at her feet and quietly asked what was impossible in this case. After some time, when the sky was covered in darkness, Yuson called Mirni to his office. She came, saying that she had been told that he had called her and asked what had happened. Without turning to her, Yuson calmly said that she should know at least one reason why he called her. She walked into the room and sat down on the sofa with a slight smile and asked if it was because he wanted to know why she didn't steal anything. He replied that she was right, and to be honest, he had two suspicions. The first was that she was completely crazy, and the second was that she had a terminal illness. Mirni, she replied that his assumptions were wrong and asked if he was overstepping boundaries with her. Enraged by her answer, he jumped up from the chair he was sitting on and approached her, cursed loudly, and began to shout that when he remembered her in the past, even at night, he jumped up in a cold sweat. He asked her if she hadn't gambled during the war, stolen the capital of the troops, and then secretly entered the Lord's castle. Turning away from him, she replied with a long smile that it was business. He irritably asked, "What now?" remembering how she once apologized with a smile and said it was a mistake. He went on to say that someone like her would never stop stealing, and he would rather believe that Valian had left the woman. Looking at the lowered head and the gloomy girl, he suggested in a cold voice to make a deal. Later, if she gets into trouble, she can contact him, but now she has to leave. He will rent her a hotel room, and she will live there, and he will give her enough money. Yuson asked if this was not a welcome offer for a wanderer like her. Contrary to his intentions, the girl began to cry, saying that the truth would keep its promise, and clasping her palms together, she begged him not to throw her out. Yuson looked at her in confusion, still not understanding what was wrong with her. Chapter 7. The war was over, and all Mirni wanted was more money, more gold, so much that she could bathe in it. Overnight, she became the richest person in the kingdom, and every lazy day she threw parties, went to the casino, and money flowed from her hands like water. But even so, the mountain of gold could not be reduced, or so she believed, until one day she came to her vault and discovered that there was no money left. Even that did not stop her. She jumped back to the gambling table and spent even the money she had borrowed. But the debt only grew. Eventually, her old habits set in, and she once again touched the royal family's property. This is how Mirni went from being a hero to being a wanted criminal, and the place she went to after her escape was her home village. But when she arrived there, she was horrified to see that all the villagers had been killed, and the village itself was in flames. Mirni knelt down, unable to comprehend what had happened, and asked if it was all because of her. She heard someone call her name and turned around, finding no one, but was surprised to recognize Luke's voice. The voice in the shocked girl's head kept talking, asking if she really thought she deserved to be forgiven, no matter what she had done, and just move on. Now she is free and will not be persecuted. But the sins she committed will still come back to her one day, and with such force that she herself will not be able to handle it. She raised her hand in surprise and looked at her trembling hand and started to cry bitterly. Yuson asked incredulously what she meant by her hand trembling. Still crying, she wiped her face with her hand and explained that it happens when she approaches the casino and everything around her starts spinning and she feels nauseous. Yuson, I thought it was definitely PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but he just waved his hand angrily at the door and told her to leave, saying that it was hard to believe, but he would postpone his offer to move her. The girl thanked him happily and left. He thought, tapping his finger on the table. No matter how much Mirni touched the fate of the royal family, they not only tried to kill members of the warrior order, but also dragged her tribe into it. Suddenly it dawned on him, it was obvious. He said it was a ploy to lower the authority of the warriors and increase the authority and power of the royal family, using Mirni's actions as an excuse for his actions. And all this was ordered by Niber, the tyrant and envious king of the kingdom alone, who unconditionally desires to always be in first place. The goddess on the phone said that she did not doubt his genius. He asked her why she didn't stop this incompetent child, saying that if she had told her, she would have listened. She replied that few people know this, but after she fulfills a wish, her influence on the lower world weakens for about 10 years. Clenching her fists, she said that she wanted to dissuade her. How could she even commit such a sin, just out of her personal desire? The goddess shouted loudly without holding back her tears. Nirber, this sinner, along with his minions, in the future, he will suffer endless pain in hell, in the most merciless and terrible place. Looking at the angrily puffing figure on the phone, he said that no matter how hard you try, the resentment of those people who were sacrificed cannot be appeased. She said that she had already sent the souls of the Mirni dead to the land of peace. Yuson asked if she knew that Mirni did this because of the king's greed. The goddess replied that she knew, but with her crime she made an excuse, and in the end she lost her tribe, so she could never forgive herself. He looked at the phone. Now he understood why the goddess was so kind to them. She was kind but very naive. The next day, Aram was bursting with messages, saying that Leonard had broken the doorknob, Sylvia had had a seizure while watching TV, and he didn't know what to do. Listening to him call out their names one by one, telling them what they'd done, Yuson's head ached, and he tiredly asked, cursing, why there wasn't a single normal person among them. But at least Mirni was probably putting on a fashion show in front of the mirror now. He removed his hands from his head and called to Aram, who answered. Then Yuson exhaled tiredly and leaned back in his chair, asking what he thought would be the best way to teach people the rules of life in Korea when these people came from other countries and were generally very different in culture and common sense. After thinking for a while, Aram asked if he had to do it. Yuson confusedly asked what he had to do. Aram replied that as far as he knew, there was an educational program for such foreign migrants, and it would not be better to send her there because the class would be held in just 1 week. After listening to him, Yuson stood up and addressed him by name. Yuson turned to him and exclaimed happily that he was a genius and pointed his finger up. Aram responded in a friendly manner by saying that he had apparently just realized that. Chapter 8. The next week, they sat in the teacher's class with other migrants. The teacher said with a smile that she was happy to see them all there and introduced herself as Yunhai Young, said that she would be their teacher and hoped that they would become friends. After a while, she called Yuson and tearfully asked him to pick her up because she couldn't stand it anymore, apologized, and said goodbye. He silently looked at the dead phone screen, and then he turned to the warriors, kneeling with outstretched arms, and asked them what the hell they had done to make the teacher cry. And deciding to start with Mirni, he turned to her. She said that she had listened well to the lectures and that the problem had arisen because of Leon, a brainless jock and an elf. Alicia looked at her menacingly and asked what kind of setup this was, to which Mirni replied that it was no setup at all. Yuson glared at them with a murderous look and then said he would give them 3 seconds to tell him the whole truth. Sitting in the classroom, Leon, who had heard about democracy, asked whether a country created by the people for the people was really normal and whether it would be better to do the opposite. Besides, rulers can pass on their power through inheritance one way or another, and don't people really know about that? The teacher hesitated and suggested the USA as an example, but Leon interrupted her and said that the USA is a country where money rules and people with powerful financial power dominate power and property and use their troops, saying that this is for the sake of world peace, and asked if this is not in the end a complete dictatorship. She looked at him fearfully, thinking that she hadn't even told him anything. Valiant asked, "What about the police? They are in the same position as the guards. But isn't there a problem in choosing such people when there are differences between men and women?" The teacher said that it was necessary for gender equality. Valiant replied that he wasn't asking about equality, but why they didn't increase their combat power. He heard about a pistol, but it is a weapon that cannot be used carelessly because of the penalties. What kind of defenders of the people are they if they have no weapons and no fighting power? The teacher covered his ears, thinking that she hadn't told him anything at all. With a frightened look, Alicia said that she had heard that racial discrimination is rampant in this world, from the oppression of blacks to the mass murder of Jews. And no one gives an answer to the question of why they discriminate and harass people with a different color, but the same kind of skin. You say that even in Korea, people with black skin are looked at with disgust. And she asked if she could be sure to say that there is no discrimination. Hearing this question, the teacher started to cry and mentally appealed to the judge. Yuson hit her on the head and said that it was her fault and that she was a racist and talked about racial discrimination. Alicia fell face down on the floor, and Yuson turned to the rest of the perpetrators. The week of happiness is over. The goddess on the phone asked if this meant that the children had made a mistake again somewhere. Yuson didn't answer, lost in thought. Even though Alicia said so, everyone else got the questions right, and it was the teacher's fault that she couldn't answer properly. A real teacher must answer even the most provocative questions fairly and impartially. The moment she cannot answer a question, she loses her qualification. She asked what the children would do in that case, and he replied that he had no choice but to teach them himself. The goddess looked at him with a smile as he taught Valiant to read and said that even though 10 years had passed, he still had the unchanging heart of a hero. Leonard approached Yuson and said he had a question. Yuson turned to him in surprise, wondering what he needed again and why he was suddenly so serious. Leonard said that, as he knew, the 5 kingdoms were regressing more and more, and as time went on, it became even more noticeable. In their world, however, everything was the other way around. Civilization only developed over time, and he was curious why they had such a big difference. Surprised, he asks why he doesn't know such simple things. Leon asks what he means and asks him to answer. He replied that there is only one difference between Midgard and Korea, whether the people pay attention to the authorities or not. Leonard repeated after him in surprise. Yuson continued, Midgard hates and rejects everything new and ordinary. Those who only care about themselves will eventually slowly and inevitably rot. And he is there on the contrary. As long as the public is watching everything, one person will not be able to monopolize everything. Power and wealth can only be guaranteed if they are distributed fairly among the people, even if it is done by force. He asked Sylvia, if there was no goddess, would the 5 The Empire survive? She indignantly said that these words could be interpreted as the world making mistakes because of the goddess, and asked him to correct her if she was wrong. He boredly plucked his ear with his finger and said that he hadn't said it was the goddess' fault because she was doing her job. Sylvia asked what happened in that case. Yuson, looking at the garbage he took out of his ear, said that it was the fault of their temple, which only pretends to be noble, but in fact poorly interprets rotten dog mess. These words felt like knives in Sylvia's heart. No longer paying attention to the girl who had fallen to her knees as her friends tried to bring her to her senses, he headed for the exit, saying that the lesson was over and they should think about everything carefully. As he entered his office, he said that they were amazing. The one who used to swing the mace in different directions now sits quietly. But the abnormal elf behaves quietly and cannot adapt in any way. The goddess asked what his thoughts were at first. He thought for a moment and answered that he thought they were idiots, worse than animals. He didn't know whether to say that they had changed from dogs back to humans, but they were still idiots. The goddess noticed that his score was very low. As night fell, Luxie was still sitting in Yosung's room, engrossed in a book, and didn't notice when he came up behind her and grabbed her by the collar of her sweater and lifted her up. He told her to get out of his room and asked how long she was going to sit there. She calmly replied that she was not going to finish reading it. He got angry at her answer and asked if she would leave on her own or with a kick in the ass. Luxie responded by simply calling him a savage. With a smile on his face, he told her to go have fun and not to get into any more trouble, and she quickly left. Yuson looked after her in silence. Chapter 9. Luxie couldn't sleep, lying on her bed listening to the girls mumbling in the beds next to her. Alicia asked out loud how they could do this to her and how they even dared. Mirni, she said that these clothes were very beautiful. Sylvia asked the goddess for forgiveness for being a sinner. Tired of this, she finally told them to shut up. As they did so, she thought that she really wanted to see it through to the end, and remembered the words of Yuson, who said that 100 Midgards reject and hate everything new and ordinary. Those who are afraid and only care about themselves will inevitably rot. It was true. She raised her hand. This is because they do not record anything. They only pass on something as an inheritance, but they do not pass on knowledge. Therefore, she clenched her fist. Here her wishes could come true. Arriving at Yosung's office, she was shocked to see a table that said no outsiders were allowed to enter, with Luxie's signature underneath. Her world was shattered. She went to Yosung, who was tying his tie, and asked him to open the door for her. He immediately refused and ordered her to leave, but she didn't back down and asked why he wouldn't open the door for her. He turned to the mirror and said that it was because she had a sickness that penetrated deeply as soon as she gained knowledge. A psychosis that wants to find the source no matter what. Luxie disagreed and said that she was not sick. Yosung disagreed, saying that she was a mentally ill person who had dissected over 100 people under the pretense of finding a cure, just to satisfy her thirst for knowledge. Luxia said that she herself agreed to the treatment. Turning to her, Yosung objected, saying that they had agreed because of her threats. She remarked that it was an inevitable sacrifice. Yosung scoffed and asked if they were really victims. And he turned to her and said that they were talking about people and she should at least feel remorse for these victims. But what did she say when he came in? Shocked by what he saw, she just asked if he had come. And he still remembers it and can repeat exactly the words, "What luck," and that all this was more than impressive, uttered by her with a smile, standing in the middle of the bloody corpses. He remembered that his hair stood on end at the sight of what she had done to those people. And even now, she probably wouldn't feel anything if hundreds or thousands of people died for her knowledge. She replied that he simply misunderstood everything, and it was for the sake of saving the city, not her curiosity. He interrupted her and said that once, even twice, it could be considered a mistake. He stared at her with an icy gaze and coldly said that the third time was no longer a mistake, but malicious intent. He immediately turned his back on her, raised his hand, and told her to stop making excuses because he didn't trust her. And I wouldn't be surprised if she ever killed dozens of people for the sake of experiments. She listened to him in silence and stopped making excuses. Yosung told her to get as far away as possible, so far away that her crazy actions wouldn't affect him. She calmly replied that she didn't want to, and that she would never leave. These words hit him like a red rag on a bull, and he shouted angrily that he had told her to get out. After she left, he sat back in his chair and wondered what was going on. The goddess told him not to get too angry or his blood pressure would rise. He angrily asked what she was talking about and yelled that he had told her not to read his mind. She hastened to justify herself, saying that he simply sighed so much that it was not difficult to guess what he was thinking about. To which he said that maybe he should turn off the game, because he can't think for himself. The goddess asked him not to do that, fearing that if their connection was severed, it would take a very long time for Midgard to return to her world. Surprised, he asked why she was making such a fuss over something so insignificant. She then asked him to imagine what he would do if the download took 1 year. He immediately understood what she meant, and the goddess said that he probably understood her now. Yosung looked at the phone and asked what he should do in that case since he can't keep his phone on forever. The goddess replied that the reason she was able to connect to her world was because of the virtual space of the game, where her followers worshipped her for finding a command. However, there are no worshippers in this real world, so she cannot incarnate. He calmly said that it is possible to go crazy because she doesn't lift a finger to live, and asked that, in this case, all the players are believers. She scoffed and said that he was making her life very easy. But Yuson didn't listen to her and thought about how he could make her come true. After a while, he and Sylvia stood at the computer, where he showed her the game and told her to look and see what she could do with it. She turned to him and asked in surprise where the magic power came from. He replied that he did not know himself and told her to look at the players, who played the role of believers. And he asked her what she thought, if there was any way, even if she was crazy, but still a saint, so she understood it well. She was angry with his attitude toward her, and she suggested that since he was so arrogant, he should find out what was what and not ask a crazy woman. Yuson calmly asked what that meant, that she wouldn't need Io's help anymore. When she heard that, she sadly fell silent because she had no more arguments. He asked with a smile why she was trying, knowing that she would lose anyway. He closed his eyes and tried to calm down. Only she would regret the consequences. She mumbled through her teeth what the method would say. Yuson quickly asked what she thought they could do. Sylvia replied that it was difficult. They only believe in God in the virtual world, and it is unlikely to affect reality. She wondered what if she put sacred power into something like a sacred object. Yuson asked about a holy object like a cross and asked if she happened to have one. She confusedly replied that she did, but she had sold most of them during her escape, and it would be better for him to just scold her. Suddenly, an idea struck her, and with a smile, she asked Yuson if he knew what idolatry was. He looked at her in confusion, thinking that she had obviously gone completely crazy.